that was my master's education. Master's degree was in renewable energy technologies. And it was at that time, towards the end of my master's program, when I started really questioning, because I enrolled in this master's program because I wanted to sort of make my contribution in the realm of climate action, because I understood back then as well that this is the greatest challenge that humankind has ever faced, this destruction of our climate and other Earth systems. So I wanted to make a contribution to that, and I enrolled in this master's program. But towards the end of the program, I started questioning what I was being taught, because it was just about deploying, technologies on this massive scale, and that is going to solve all our problems, because apparently the only problem we've got is greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions. So they were only talking about this small slice of the problem. And I started questioning, where are all the materials, the metals and the minerals that go into building all these, so-called green energy technologies going to come from? Well, they're going to have to be mined and processed, and all that requires a lot of fossil fuel use, for one, but also destruction of ecosystems and habitats, and exploitation of people, even genocides to get people off their land that has the resources that these grand industrial climate action plans have. So I started reading, and I started understanding that the framing with which climate action is presented is entirely misguided, because it pushes this techno-industrialist view that ignores the concerns and the experiences and the needs of the vast majority of people worldwide, especially people living in places where the resources would have to be extracted from.
Welcome to Truth and Reckoning, a broadcast from CELDF. In this show, we'll learn from frontline organizers and communities fighting against environmental destruction. We'll explore different perspectives and innovative strategies for movement building, the potency and the potential of rights of nature, and effective action in defense of our communities. And we'll share inspiring stories of people working towards right relationship with the land and each other. I am your host, Max Wilbert. I'm here with Aashis Joshi. Aashis is a former PhD candidate who is studying climate adaptation. He lives in Kathmandu, Nepal, and is a brilliant thinker, somebody who I have been reading his writing for, I don't know, it's been a couple of years probably since we initially connected, Aashis. I joined an event that you spoke at last year that was a critique of the degrowth movement's approach to technology, climate adaptation, and the poly crisis that we're facing in general. And I thought your comments were quite brilliant and important there. And all of this led me to want to have this conversation with you, to expose more people to your thinking and the way you look at the world, hopefully so that you can educate people and help shift all of us, our movements, in a more effective direction, a more clear seeing direction. So would you mind telling us a little bit more about who you are, your background, where you're from, and how you got involved in this work?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your very generous introduction, Max. So yes, hi everyone. I'm Aashis, and I'm a citizen of Nepal. I was born and I grew up here, and until earlier this year, I was pursuing a PhD in climate change adaptation at a university in the Netherlands. But I left the PhD after having figured out for myself that this wasn't the right path to make the kind of positive difference that I want to make in this world, especially when it comes to our responses to the accelerating climate and ecological breakdown. as well as many social and geopolitical justices that are happening, accelerating worldwide, which ultimately have the same root causes as our destruction of the Earth's biosphere. So my 4 years pursuing the PhD there led me to conclude that there are many blind spots and flaws with the way climate and ecological action research is done. Research and education both are done in Western academia, or in academia in general, at universities and research institutes. And so I left. I had some significant disagreements with my supervisors as well. So I left my pursuit of my PhD, and I'm currently trying to make whatever impact I can in this area of work via public education and awareness. And I'm thinking of ways to start doing that kind of work. So there's more to come from me on that front very soon. But yeah, before the PhD, as I said, I was born and I grew up in Nepal. And at the age of 20, I went to the United States to get to pursue my undergraduate education. I got a scholarship at a university there, um, and yeah, I studied chemical engineering as an undergraduate, but I've never actually worked as an engineer. Yeah, so I studied chemical engineering, but I wasn't really interested in pursuing that line of work. So a few years after finishing my undergraduate degree, I decided to apply for a master's program in renewable energy technologies in Europe, and I got a scholarship to pursue a master's degree in Europe, and it was enrolled in this master's program that is organized by the European Commission, I think, and where they select students from different parts of the world, and so we, like, each master's program is organized by this consortium of three or four universities, and we spend one semester each at one university in one European country, and then move on to another one in another country. So yeah, that was my master's education. Master's degree was in renewable energy technologies, and it was at that time, towards the end of my master's program, when I started really questioning, because I enrolled in this master's program because I wanted to sort of make my contribution in the realm of climate action, because I understood back then as well that this is the greatest challenge that humankind has ever faced, this destruction of our climate and other Earth systems. So I wanted to make a contribution to that, and I enrolled in this master's program. But towards the end of the program, I started questioning what I was being taught, because it was just about deploying, technologies on this massive scale, and, and that is going to solve all our problems, because apparently the only problem we've got is greenhouse gas, or CO2 emissions. So they were only talking about this small slice of the problem. And I started questioning, where are all the materials, the metals and the minerals that go into building all these, so-called green energy technologies going to come from? Well, they're going to have to be mined and processed, and all that requires a lot of fossil fuel use, for one, but also destruction of ecosystems and habitats, and exploitation of people, even genocides, to get people off their land that has the resources that these grand industrial climate action plans have. So I started reading, and I started understanding that the framing with which climate action is presented is entirely misguided, because it pushes this techno-industrialist view that ignores the concerns and the experiences and the needs of the vast majority of people worldwide, especially people living in places where the resources would have to be extracted from. So at the end of that master's program in renewable energy technologies, I knew I still wanted to make whatever difference I could in this realm. And so I applied to this PhD program in climate change adaptation, thinking that, it wouldn't be so technology focused. But of course, I at the university in the Netherlands, where I was pursuing my PhD, uh, I mean, much of the research work that was done there was very tech heavy, and with the same major blind spots of, like ignoring the need for extraction and ecocide. And I also felt that my research work, the project that I was involved in during my PhD, thought there wasn't an opportunity for me within that project to sort of really work on the more fundamental issues that I thought were necessary in order to realistically and honestly address, these huge, this huge planetary, crisis that, our civilization has created. So I thought, the work that I was doing was quite sort of superficial, in the sense that, that it wasn't about addressing the fundamental, like problematic ideologies. It was just trying to sort of make some tweaks and some adjustments in the existing system without getting to the root causes of why it is causing so much destruction in, you know in ecosystems and in the lives of people worldwide. So yeah, this was quite a long and sort of a winding introduction, but this is my this is basically my background in this field, let's say. And yeah.
Thank you, Aashis. I appreciate that. There's a lot of notes that I was making while you're speaking. One is just reflecting on the fact that the Netherlands, of course, for people who aren't aware, is something like a quarter of the nation is below sea level. And so starting, 600 years ago, they embarked on a major project of reclamation, putting in
Hmm.
dikes and levees and dams to basically create new farmland, new living space out of this landscape that wasn't really suitable for people to reside in. And so, in a sense, it's no surprise that the climate adaptation program based there was going to be so tech heavy, because that entire nation's existence almost is dependent upon this highly intensive engineering of the landscape, which I'm not too familiar with the Netherlands. You probably know far more than me, but I would imagine that the ecology has been significantly impacted and harmed by all of that. I know that here where I live in Oregon in the United States, and there's a coastal landscape. We're on the Pacific here, and there's all kinds of salt marshes and estuaries along the ocean where similar things were done, dikes and levees put in
Hmm.
place to reclaim farmland in these rich soils and make more grazing land for cattle and so on. And that has been a pretty significant part of why the salmon in this region have been pushed towards extinction, because those habitats were critical for young salmon in particular to grow up in as they came out of the streams where they had been born and were preparing to enter the ocean, but needed
Hmm.
these sort of intermediate habitats that were partly saltwater, partly freshwater, where they could grow up and get stronger and get prepared for the different chemistry and the different predators they might face out in the open ocean. There's been various restoration work that's being done here in different areas to start to remove some of those dikes and levees and restore those marshes and estuaries. But yeah, it's no surprise to me that a Dutch climate adaptation program might focus on that type of thing. I've seen articles, news stories about various projects along the Dutch model of climate adaptation, built levees or sea gates in places like New York City to hold back storm surge, high tides which are exacerbated by rising seas, of course. So, that's just a thought that came to mind. I don't know if you have any reflection on sort of that element in the Dutch character of the technology focused and intervention focused approach to adaptation.
Yes, well, when I was during my time in the Netherlands, I definitely got to learn about, the history of the Netherlands, how it was mostly land that has been reclaimed from the sea by pumping out water and then using dikes to block out the ocean. And yeah, the general I agree with you. It is in large part because of this history, this technological prowess, that climate adaptation or climate action work, research work, in the Netherlands tends to be very tech heavy, because there is this sort of confidence, or there's this confidence or overconfidence, whatever you want to call it. We've managed to ward off the sea for centuries now. We have the right kind of, the capacity and the skill set to be able to continue to, do this in the future. But I think, but not everyone, of course, not all research programs are like that. There's also awareness that, because as you said, as it is the case in Oregon as well, there have been massive ecological problems that those dikes in that infrastructure has caused. Because similar kinds of problems, the migration routes of fish, between the saltwater and the freshwater migration routes, those have been disrupted. And there's other problems such as salt intrusion in agricultural lands, for example, because of the unequal pressure of the ocean water. I think there's a very interesting mechanism why that happens, and hopefully readers will able to, hopefully we can, you may be able to share a link to an article or something, but basically there's an intrusion of salt water in the freshwater water table because of this artificial barrier that's been placed to block out the ocean. Those are, there are ecological problems in the Netherlands related to these technologies to hold off or fend off the sea. But also there are other major ecological problems there related to the massive agricultural system there, where the freshwater bodies, the soil, a lot of pollution due to animal waste, and lots of algal blooms in the water bodies. So there are a whole range of ecological problems related to this turbocharged deployment of technology in the Netherlands. And most of the climate adaptation work that gets done there is still a very tech focused and tech heavy. And in my PhD work as well, which involved making computer models to sort of try to evaluate the effectiveness of certain kinds of policy measures in climate adaptation, I was encouraged to, sort of model, the impact of these different kinds of technological interventions. So there is definitely this tech focus, but there are also researchers, and there is this growing awareness that technology is not going to be able to solve all these problems. And there are researchers who try to sort of look at alternatives, including letting the sea take over. There are projects where just as in Oregon, to sort of dismantle some of the dikes and sort of restore the natural, waterways and flows of water and life in the water. So there are those projects happening. But on the whole, I think, the ambition of not just the Netherlands, but most climate action research, including climate adaptation research that gets done, tends to be very tech focused. And what are the technologies that we need, and how are we to best deploy them? But this sort of research work usually it tends to ignore the wider, the bigger picture, the systems and the ideologies, the social and political, geopolitical beliefs and systems that we have in place that are at the root of these massive problems, and that are also huge barriers to to do anything about, to be able to start doing anything about these problems. So the underlying systems are largely not challenged in the research work done.
Yeah, on that note, I'm thinking about, of course, the colonial history of the Dutch, right? They invaded and took over Indonesia and much of the surrounding region. They had a big presence in southern Africa, eastern and northeastern South America, southern India. The revenues created by these colonial overseas empires were in large part what funded these projects of reclamation and agricultural expansion and domination. So I want to put a pin in that, because you made the comments earlier about how this sort of modern technological approach to solving or adapting to global warming, dependent on technology, requires and is linked to today different forms of exploitation, mining, even genocide, and various forms of harm to communities, which usually, but not always, are overseas, right? Sometimes they're sort of internal peripheries or internal colonies but often they're overseas colonies or places which are being exploited. So I want to put a pin in that because I think that's a big theme of our conversation. But, I just wanted to touch briefly back, since we're on this topic, of the salmon here and the migratory fish there, and the extent to which some people might just look at that and say it's a technological problem itself. That's an engineering problem. And that approach has been tried here in the Pacific Northwest region where I live, where salmon populations have plummeted. They are in free fall from their incredible abundance, millions, tens of millions of fish, large fish, some of them 5-6 feet long, 2 meters in length, and 40 kilograms, 100 pounds. And those fish are a keystone species. They were going up the rivers, bringing all these nutrients from the ocean into the forests and high into the stream, sometimes swimming thousands of miles, thousands of kilometers upstream into these small little tributaries and spawning and dying there and bringing all those nutrients into the surrounding areas to the bears and the wolves and the eagles and the human beings who were eating them and distributing all that nutrients around the landscape. And so a lot of people have looked at salmon, not just as this incredibly beautiful species, this keystone ecologically, not just a fish, but really as a crucial mechanism by which the entire ecosystem in this region functioned to cycle nutrients on almost a continental scale, from ocean back into landscape and then landscape back into ocean again, and thus keep the cycle of life flourishing and growing. And so I think that, the approach so that all stopped, after colonization. There was huge amounts of overfishing of the salmon. There were canneries where salmon were just caught in their tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and packed into cans and shipped to big population centers. And also the dams were constructed on almost all of the rivers in this region. They were dammed, and that stopped the fish migrating upstream. That's in addition to the destruction of these estuaries and wetland habitats and so on. So the net effect of all of this is the extirpation of salmon runs from many of the streams and rivers in which they were historically running, and the collapse of the runs in those that still remain. I mean, 90 to 95% gone, if not more. And the response to that over the last 50, 60 years in this region has been a technological one. It has been, how do we solve this issue using engineering principles? And so that has meant establishing hatcheries to grow millions and millions of baby salmon in essentially artificial conditions, like a fish tank, a glorified fish tank, and then putting them out into the ecosystem, building fish ladders at the dams so that fish can go up past them. Sometimes, often they'll do things like even catch the fish that are trying to migrate upstream, put them in trucks in water, and then drive them around upstream. And all of this hasn't worked. It's perhaps slowed the rate of the decline, but they're still declining because the habitat isn't good. The climate is warming. These fish need cold water, abundant fresh water.
Yeah. The oxygen content of the water is decreasing.
Right. It's very low. Yeah.
And then I think also I read an article a few months back saying how the dust that that vehicle tires give off, they contain this compound. I think it's a kind of plastic or something. It's extremely toxic to salmon, apparently.
Yes, absolutely.
So
yeah,
there's
the
a
research
whole
on
bunch
that
of
was
impacts on multiple fronts, and it's not just for
yeah.
This is emblematic of I think the multi-pronged assault that we have unleashed on all the different systems of our planet.
Yes.
Not the climate.
And it's very interesting from a climate adaptation perspective, because scientists who study salmon are projecting that climate change is going to have a major, major negative impact on them. Increasing water temperatures, decreasing dissolved oxygen in the water, like you said, changing the timing of pulses in these water systems because of not having as much snow during the winter, snow melting earlier, different factors like this. And this is projected to have a major impact right now. But for the time being and for the previous decades, the major impact on salmon has not been driven by climate. It's been driven by these other factors. That remains true today. And so often, like you were saying, these responses to climate change become blinkered. They become focused on one aspect of the totality of the ecological and social crises that we're experiencing in the world today. And that, in my opinion, leads to ineffective solutions. It leads to false solutions. And that's what we see with the salmon as sort of a poster child. And I'm not familiar with the migratory fish in the Netherlands, but I know they exist. I know throughout Europe, various migratory, I think they call them androgynous fish, which are similar to salmon.
I think they're
They're
eels.
born in
I think they're
streams.
possibly eels
Yeah, eels too.
in that
Born
part
in
of Europe.
streams, and then they come
Yeah.
downstream to the ocean, live their adult life in the ocean, and then go back upstream to spawn. Those fish are struggling across Europe due to these factors.
Yeah. I think, yeah, exactly. These kinds of, blinkered solutions, I think one of the major reasons, and this is something that, climate action research and academia, the entire education system has to reflect upon urgently, is that the higher education system is creating all these, like highly educated people, but the kind of education they're providing to people and the kind of research that they're also doing is very blinkered, as we've said. It does not include. I mean, one of the major sort of side effects, let's say, of the higher education system is, I think, that it makes its graduates and the people who work in that system think they're smarter than they actually are, because well, once you go through all these years of education and training and you pass those exams, and it's a very hard journey to get those degrees and those qualifications. And once you get them, then I think it sort of instills this unjustified feeling of knowing a lot more than you actually do about the world. And yes, I mean, the system may teach you quite a lot about human societies and how we use technologies and many different aspects of human systems, but in terms of the way the world works as a biophysical, this kind of education, this kind of comprehensive worldview is sorely lacking. And researchers and students as well as researchers who sort of are involved who work in the realm of climate science or climate action, one of the great disservices that the academic system has done is to sort of instill this mentality of thinking that just because you have qualifications, the highest qualifications possible, means that you, or the work that you are doing, or the kind of thinking that you are habituated to is the right kind of thinking. Because if that were the case, then we might have seen some good progress on addressing all these major ecological problems that we've created. But as you've pointed out, the technological solutions that get designed and deployed usually tend to make the situation even worse in many cases. The best they've been able to do is perhaps slow down the rate of destruction, when at this crucial time, this unprecedented era in human history, where we're facing a total collapse of many different interconnected earth systems, this kind of blinkered view is lethal. It is proving to be very inadequate and dangerous and misleading. I think one of the great disservices that the education and research system has done is to sort of instill this false sense of security as well, I think, in the global public, that there are people who understand these things, who have the right kind of knowledge and expertise to sort of steer our societies towards a more sustainable path. I think the sense of false confidence, or the sense of that there are people who understand things, the complicated nature of the world well enough to sort of be able to propose technological solutions to these problems, or design technological solutions. I think this has been one of the major, what do you call it, the major harms, let's say, one of the major harms that the climate research enterprise is doing right now, I think.
Yeah. A couple thoughts come to mind in response to that, Aashis. I grew up in Seattle, and so when I go and visit my family there, it's a very progressive, liberal city. And one of the things that you'll see often is people have these signs out in their yard and they say various things like various progressive slogans like immigrants are welcome here and different things like that. One of the things that they say is we believe science or something along those lines. And on the one hand, it's an understandable and admirable response to the ascendance of climate denialism, to the fossil fuel industry's very real successful attempts to spread misinformation and sow doubt about the basic science of global warming and so on. But on the other hand, it betrays to me what is sort of a common flaw in the liberal psyche in places like Seattle in the United States and probably across much of the Western world, which is a tendency to treat science and the scientific endeavor as a sort of God, to treat progress itself as a sort of God. So, these are largely secular communities, but in a sense, they've replaced the worship of God, of a Christian God, often in these contexts, the United States, previously that their parents and their grandparents might have had, with a worship that is not self-conscious, that is not self-reflective of the scientific endeavor and progress and technology. Mm-hmm. And it's in my view, and it's something that I'm not sure we're veering into the realm of philosophy here. This may be sort of an inherent danger in the human psyche and our makeup as beings when you combine that with our intelligence, our cunning, and our ability to create these scientific endeavors that build knowledge beyond what is really comprehensible to one person, right? Like I've studied some climate science, I've studied some ecology and some things along these lines. But like you were saying earlier, the scale of these scientific enterprises is so broad that no one person can be an expert in more than one thing. And only a few people, those who have the privilege of getting education, can even be an expert in anything. And it sort of creates this disconnect between wisdom and knowledge. It creates this disconnect between people who may not have access to these levels of education and the knowledge itself. And that disconnect has been exploited quite successfully by figures like Trump, by the far right around the world, who are putting disinformation, propaganda, and so on into those cracks and using them to leverage apart sort of these basic systems of knowledge production and assimilation that have been built since the Enlightenment, and probably going back far before that if we talk about traditional ecological knowledge as a form of observation, right? Observation, developing theses, and then testing them against the real world. That's sort of an innate human thing to do. That's curiosity, that's knowledge accumulation. And so that, of course, goes back far deeper than the Enlightenment. But I've seen this process play out myself that you were just talking about, Aashis, in one, to sort of try and bring us back away from the philosophy, maybe, because we could go down that road for a long time. They're interesting and perhaps important discussions. But I, in 2010, traveled to the Russian Arctic with a group of climate scientists. And it was an expedition that was funded by the National Science Foundation here in the US. And the people who were participating were professors in climate science fields, limnologists, people who were studying oceanographers, people who were studying all kinds of elements of the carbon cycle, essentially, in these Arctic environments, as well as, postdocs and graduate students, and even some undergrads who were there to sort of get experience in climate research. And I was brought along under a new element in this program, which had been ongoing for many years at that point, I was an environmental journalism student at the time. And the idea was basically scientists aren't any good at communicating about these issues. So let's bring along, some people who are professionals at communicating this complex science, trying to translate it into language that everyday people can understand. And what I found when I was there, which was very disconcerting to me, although even at that age it wasn't entirely unexpected, was that I found the climate scientists to be very, very naive. And these were highly educated people, people working at some of the most prestigious scientific and research institutions from around the world, not just the US. And they had an incredibly deep understanding of climate science, of carbon cycling, of all these dynamics. And yet, when it came to understanding politics or power or social change, they knew nothing at all. Nothing, essentially nothing. And I don't say that to disparage them. Many of them were great people, people who I personally liked and admired and think they're doing important work in the world. But many of them seem to be laboring under the apprehension that it was their role as scientists to provide high quality facts. Those facts would go into the public sphere via journalism, press releases, and so on. They would get disseminated to politicians and to the public, who would then vote and make decisions based on those facts that would lead to resolving the problem that they were looking at. That's probably a simplification, right? I don't want to act like these people were completely ignorant of how politics really works in the world, how dirty it is, how dangerous it is, how indirect it is and challenging. But by and large, I was really struck by that these people felt like their role was to get the information. And in terms of solving the issues or doing anything about it, that was other people's responsibility. And again, I don't want to sort of seem like I'm casting aspersions on these people, because I have a great deal of admiration for the work of climate scientists and other people who are doing, basic ecology, for example, to understand what's being done to the planet. Just like I have a great deal of respect for social scientists who are studying the dynamics of imperialism and modern forms of colonialism and so on. But nonetheless, I was kind of struck by how, and this, Aashis, was actually replicated. I'm finishing up a master's degree in degrowth right now. And I was struck throughout the process of this master's by how theoretical the educational process was. There was a lot of recreation of knowledge, but very little about applied action. And, my experience coming in as a community organizer, as somebody who's been working on these issues and educating on the issues that are sort of adjacent to degrowth for a couple decades now, was, why isn't this, like, we're in a crisis. Why isn't this academic program focused 80% on practical examples? Let's study what people are doing in communities which are resisting industrial development and the spread of destructive capitalist projects. Let's study the methods that they're using, the decision-making structures, the challenges they're facing, the types of repression that they're experiencing, and how they're fighting back against that. Let's study historical movements and try and learn what we can from revolutions and civil rights struggles and liberation movements and so on. Try and pull out the strategic lessons from those and apply those within the context of degrowth in the modern era. There was very, very little of that, almost nothing throughout an entire master's degree program. And I was just shocked by that, because to me it feels like dereliction. It feels like dereliction of duty, in a sense. It feels like here we are in this crisis, and yet largely the best that academia can manage to do is to continue this sort of scientific process that has been the way that academia has functioned for years and decades, which is to replicate knowledge and to expand the realms of knowledge in a very theoretical sense. And of course, academia as a whole, we could say, has been leveraged far more by those in power, by the ruling class, by corporations, by militaries, to expand their ability to control the natural world, to engage in processes of colonialism and extraction, than it has been for the sake of justice, and certainly for the sake of sustainability. So I don't know, that was a lot. So I wonder what you think about that.
No, I completely agree. And you touched upon a very important point towards the end there, when you said that, you were completely shocked by this dereliction of duty of, not studying, all these different resistance movements that have arisen in different parts of the world in recent decades and still do. And I think this is a very important point, because it shows to me how misguided, and perhaps this is by design, how misguided academia or the research and education, system is with regards to our responses to climate and ecological destruction, because I think the focus should really be on empowering people and communities. It should be on I think the main focus at this time, at this really critical, moment in our lives in human history, should be on figuring out how the global public might be able to regain the agency that has been sort of taken away from us by the ruling class over the past decades. And this process of stripping away, of depleting the public's agency, political agency, and ability to sort of envision the future and act upon it, I think this has been eroded significantly by the ruling class and the corporations they helm, by making us dependent on their systems for our livelihood, basically. And this is something that we desperately need to sort of escape if we are to be able to do anything about improving the situation, of halting the destruction that we're unleashing and accelerating on our planet. But instead, we have this academic and research system in which a select small group of usually very privileged, usually white people are put in positions of like doing research and figuring out, okay, this is what the future should be like, and this is how we're going. This is the path that that we advise the nations of the world, human societies, the global collective to take. I think that opens the doors to all sorts of abuse. When you have a small group of people, usually privileged people with a certain type of worldview that is inherently shaped by their privileged upbringing, I think if you have this small group of people creating knowledge on how to approach the major problems that we face, I think it's a system that is open to abuse. It's can be easily manipulated by those with power and wealth. And it is a way, I think, increasingly over the past few years, I've come to believe that it is a way, by design, it is a way to sort of erode the global public's political agency and concentrate it, certain institutions or certain types of institutions. And also, so in such a way that it's easy for the ruling class to set the agenda and the vision for the future. And they just, like tell researchers and educators to uh, sort of, think in a certain way, or to teach or to do research in a certain way or about certain topics. And I saw this when I was pursuing my PhD in the Netherlands as well, because much of the climate action work there is funded by these big corporations, by oil companies and petrochemical, like plastic manufacturers, and all these big companies that claim to want to be more sustainable. They throw around some funds for renewable energy research and development and that sort of thing. But I mean, it would be entirely naive to believe that they have any intention of actually reducing their environmental impact. For them, it's profit is the only motive that they have. And they've made it clear as well over the past few years. I mean, several times we've read news that this big oil company, they sort of make these targets to reduce their emissions by, I don't know, let's say 50% over the next 10 years or something, and then they do nothing over the 10 years, and then after a few years they just said, oh, we're going to scale back the target, or we're going to ditch it altogether, or it never their plans never materialize. But these institutions, these academic and research institutions, they continue to work with these deceitful corporations. They take funding, so in the end it's also a very careerist sort of enterprise. The climate action academic and education system, because it's about people's careers, where the funding comes from. And in the modern neoliberal capitalist world, the funding comes from these corporations and the massive profits they generate from wrecking the planet and the lives of people and non-human living beings all over the world. I think, I'm very suspicious. I'm suspicious of the academic and research enterprise, although there are many people who are genuine and who are honest and who try to do good work, who are aware of these major problems with academia. But I think that that's not a significant, or that's not a large portion of academics. And most of them are quite blinkered in their thinking because of this, because the education system tells that trains you to think of yourself as an expert without bothering to sort of learn about the complexity of the world, and not just the ecological complexity but the political complexity of the world as well. And many of these researchers, I think, for many of them, it's also down to ignorance. Again, the education system with its blinkered, like, silo thinking, and training people to be effective in certain kinds of professions or in certain kinds of disciplines. I think that's that kind of highly specialized way of going about things. I think it's one of the major flaws in the way we globally approach our response or potential responses to climate change. I think from very early age, it should be absolutely like mandatory to educate people, since from the time they are kids, to have a sort of a more comprehensive, holistic knowledge of the world and the different systems and components that make it up. But that is not what the modern education and research system does. It sort of tries to create silo thinkers, because I think when you have silo thinkers and people who are highly specialized, I think it's easier to control people. If people in society are highly specialized, then they become dependent on the system for their livelihood. And I think part of it is, I don't know what part of it, but some part of it certainly is by design that this is the case. And I think if the education system were to go about, doing a good, honest job of really educating people, I think at this time it is absolutely essential for everyone to have sort of a basic level of ecological and ethical education. And this includes knowledge education on historical and ongoing geopolitical injustices, especially arising from Western imperialism. The education system changes in that direction. I find it hard to see how it's going to be relevant or helpful in addressing the existential threats we've created for ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's very well said.
I would be curious to learn your thoughts about this aspect of, like, there's many things that, we need to question, and academia, the education system, needs to question. And one of them is this modern system in which, we are highly specialized in the kind of work we do for our livelihood. In the past, our ancestors were not so specialized, and not being specialized is, of course, perhaps you don't scale the heights of intellectual achievement so much, but it's more equitable. People are more educated and able to understand what the problems are, and whether the solutions that are being proposed are going in the right direction, or whether they ignore some like things that should not be ignored. People become better critical thinkers. People also, if the more highly specialized people are in the kind of work they do, the easier it becomes for the system, for the ruling class, to control them, because highly specialized people, they have to make their livelihood. I mean, you can only have a highly specialized sort of society if you have ample food production, or if you have if somebody else is producing all the food and clothes and other essentials. If so, what I'm trying to say is, in a highly specialized society where people are reliant on a narrow skill set to make their living, it's easier. I mean, they become so dependent on the system to make their livings that it becomes easy for the ruling class to control them, and it becomes hard for the people to escape that kind of system. And this is the world that, this is basically what the modern techno-industrial neoliberal world order is, or has done to us. It has completely robbed us of our agency, because now we need to do jobs rather than grow our food to survive. We become so dependent on the system and so easy to control. So I wanted to learn your thoughts on this aspect of this social and cultural and political aspect of the bind that we find ourselves in at this moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I have a lot of thoughts on that topic, because my ancestry is European, and you go back far enough, and my ancestors were indigenous people. They were living on the land in Europe. They were living in traditional ways, sustainable ways, in deep, ongoing, multi-generational relationship with place. And eventually they were assimilated into empire, largely through the expansion of the Roman Empire and then subsequent empires. My ancestors were, in a very similar way to what happened to what's been happening to indigenous people in North America. There's a process of conquest, assimilation, integration into power structures in different ways. And that obviously happened thousands of years ago in Europe. And so that's happened in many different places around the planet at different times. Both of us have critiqued the work of Jason Hickel quite a bit, but one term that he introduced me to that I liked was forced proletarianization. And he was talking about a process whereby communities and people who are relatively self-sufficient and can provide for themselves are forced through conquest, through economic circumstances, through other means to participate in a wage economy, essentially, to provide for themselves. And that is the process by which empires expand their power. They incorporate new labor power and new lands into their empire. And this is a process that empires throughout history have engaged in. The United States and its allies today are no different, in a similar way to, I don't see China as being substantially different from this, right? They've worked to proletarianize through a process of forced proletarianization to expand their labor force to gain access to new lands and resources through various forms of economic and sometimes military colonialism. But of course, the United States has kind of been the dominant player on that field for a long time and remains that way today. And Europe as well. Of course, we talked about the Dutch colonialism. There's a quote that I often refer to. I don't have it handy, but it's something along the lines of, the West won the world not through superiority of thinking, philosophy, or culture, but through superiority in applying organized violence. Westerners often forget this, but non-Westerners rarely do. And, I think that's the reality that is so often lost, especially in fields like academia, where information is kind of sanitized and you're trying to take your objective, you're trying to be objective, and you're trying to take your perspective out of it. You're trying to not look at, politics is far too complicated for most scientists to study. Social sciences aren't considered hard sciences. And it's because there's no right answer, right? You can't do the chemical formula or balance the equation or run the numbers on the model and get a clean answer out of it. You're dealing with these inherently slippery, highly complex, changeable subjects. Chemistry doesn't change, right? Physics doesn't change as far as we know. So those are considered the hard sciences. And so across academia, I think you've got this situation where academics have simply, in large part, shied away from engagement on these topics. That's not true entirely. And that's one reason why the Trump administration, for example, and oppressive governments throughout history and around the world have targeted academia for repression, because knowledge, when it's combined with, the academia and learning and schooling and education, when it's combined with realistic and radical knowledge about politics, about colonialism, about empire and violence and how these systems function, is highly, highly dangerous to the status quo. Most revolutionary movements have been led and organized by people who have quite a bit of education, because they've read widely, they've studied philosophy, they've studied law, they've studied these topics and understand sort of how society functions, how economics function, and it's led them to this place where they can do these things. So those in power target academia, and that's one reason why academics often keep their heads down on these issues. They don't want to be targeted. They don't want to have the head of their department come talk to them. They don't want the dean to get mad at them. They don't want to lose their funding for their research project, right? They don't want to be targeted for various forms of harassment, a cancellation, a blacklisting. So I think one response to that is simply courage. I think we really need academics to have courage and to stand up against these things. But even then, I think there remains an inherent danger in the sort of culturally blinkered silo effect that you talked about earlier. I don't feel like I necessarily have the easy solution to that, but in theory, I think there's certainly a lot of value in sort of a classical education that covers a wide range of topics. I mean, this was the whole idea of a liberal arts education, which, there's a lot of critique of those institutions and that history that emerged from. But I think there is a lot of value in trying to, if you're going to educate people, teach them history, teach them politics, art, philosophy, science, mathematics. Try to educate people to be well-rounded, to understand a wide range of topics, and to understand them in relationship to each other. Because I think that fosters a sort of complex thinking, a systems thinking, which is so often lacking in academia and in the culture at large.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I guess that would be my initial thought on that, Aashis. I don't know if that makes sense to you as well.
No, absolutely. That kind of education that allows people to sort of engage in joined up thinking, connecting the dots, how different injustices and different environmental impacts are interconnected. I think that has got to be the foundation moving forward if we want to, take any real and meaningful climate and ecological action, and also action against geopolitical injustices and imperialism. And one thing that it's not just about, one thing that I saw during my time pursuing a PhD in the Netherlands is that the people who are working as researchers, as professors in this field are often sort of, resistant to actually expand their scope of knowledge. Perhaps it's because they're already set in their careers, and they've been lauded, and they've achieved successes with their research projects and whatnot. But I think there's this resistance to like expanding their worldview because they're so comfortable and confident in their way of thinking and their solutions that they have been working on. Yeah, especially people who are working on technological solutions to climate change have this sort of attitude. I mean, I think in any field you'll find people who work with or who create design technologies, they sort of tend to have this sense of superiority. That is my perception. But there's this unwillingness or this slowness, let's say, to expand your worldview and your knowledge. But also, um, one of the things that I found very worrying and very quite shocking, actually, was how hesitant climate action researchers were to sort of really, to really appreciate the gravity of the situation that we're in. I think, I mean, I don't know what the reason is, but perhaps it's just many climate researchers have this silo thinking and think that climate change is the major problem that we face. But I think we're facing, or we're destroying the biosphere in 10 or 12 different ways, at least, if not more. So there's this multi-pronged, all-out assault on the biosphere, which is a systemic assault, and it requires a major overhaul of the system, of the systems that make up modern human civilization. But there's this unwillingness to also acknowledge the gravity of the situation. I think people just put it into this climate change box, and then it becomes easier to manage or think about. But and it becomes perhaps easier to sort of focus your blinkered attention on. But then you sort of miss 90% of the rest of the the problems, or the causes, especially the root causes of the problems, and you're focused on solving this one aspect without considering what the solution is going to going. I wanted to also know your thoughts on how like, what are your perceptions, or what are your views on how honest climate action research and education tends to be in terms of the scale of the problems we face? Because I think the scale and the severity of the problems are not sort of communicated well enough, or taught well enough, or realistically enough to students. And I think many researchers and scholars are also do not sort of grasp the calamitous situation that we're in. And that has also taken many of them, or perhaps most of them, down misguided paths in their search for solutions.
Yeah. Well, it's been quite common for people to point out that there's perhaps a disconnect in the human psyche between, the way that we evolved, which was to deal with problems that are in front of us, with problems that are human scale. And now we're dealing with this there's a term that I want to say was coined by Wainwright and his co-author in their book Climate Leviathan, or at least maybe they use the term, but I'm forgetting it. It's like a super crisis or something along those lines is the phenomenon they use. And they're basically talking about how global warming and many of the other ecological crises that we face, more broadly, all the crises that we face are problems that are so large and encompass every aspect of the societies that we've been born into, that we didn't make the choice to create, but that we were born into as they are, more or less, that it becomes paralyzing. It's almost like it's a fairy tale or a fiction story that's being told to us rather than something real. And I think a lot of people feel that way. You talked earlier about how our agency and our ability to envision the future has been taken away from us. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's in large part been a deliberate process. Empires and systems of control don't function best when they're actually having to employ violence and direct forms of repression to ensure consent. They function best when people go along. And that's often why violence and various forms of repression are used. It's a threat. It's a threat to try to force people to go along, to not challenge these systems, and thus to make it possible for the systems to continue. I think that you've written recently, you wrote something about how the ruling class in the West knows that this climate crisis and all the other ecological resource scarcity, et cetera, crises that we're facing are going to lead to mass migration on a scale that's almost unthinkable. Billions of people potentially forced out of their homes and their communities and even their countries and forced to move. Breakdowns in food systems, increase in frequency and strength of various forms of storms and disasters. We were talking before the call recording began about the monsoon being quite different this year in Nepal. And it's well known that climate change, one of the effects it's already having is creating significant shifts in the timing and intensity of the monsoon across basically all of South Asia. And that, of course, is, I don't have to tell you this, but for the listeners, that's sort of the foundation of the ecology. That's what all the plants and animals, life cycles, and people as well, livelihoods has been built upon for forever there. So, since the Himalayas rose or something along those lines. So those in power know that this crisis is happening, that it's very real. I personally don't believe for a second that people like Trump are actually climate deniers. I think he's leveraging climate denialism, just like the fossil fuel companies leverage it, even though they conducted some of the first research on climate change. Not first, but some of the early research on climate change. And they well understand what a crisis it is. And yet, people in power act to protect their own power and expand it. This is sort of the pathology of these hierarchical systems that we live in. They're not responding rationally. And of course, in our political and economic systems, those who are best able to disregard harm that they're causing to others and push forward in light of that are rewarded economically, politically, and so on. And so I think, quite frankly, we probably have a high degree of sociopaths, like clinical sociopaths who are in position of power, people who do not feel empathy in the same way that you or I do, people who wouldn't blink an eye if they had to betray a friend or physically hurt or kill someone, who wouldn't regret it at all. That's what sociopathology is. It's a mental illness, that not a mental illness, but perhaps a genetic condition. I'm not sure exactly, that results in this total lack of empathy for others. These people can be very charming, very charismatic, and it's well documented if you study psychology that these people exist and have probably always existed to some degree. I believe they can be created as well. Pathology can also be sort of a later in life development based on other experiences. But I'm not an expert, so I could be wrong about some elements of that. but it's well known. There was a book that came out a number of years ago called The Psychopath Next Door, and it was about how common this is actually, and how it's not very well known that psychopaths are actually quite common. I want to say, I forget what the numbers were, but it was certainly more than 1 in 100. And so, this, if we understand this, then it helps us understand what you were writing about. What I said was they understand this crisis, they understand how bad it is, and yet they're not responding to it by working to avert the crisis, working to dramatically restructure our societies, our economies, our way of life, working to reduce injustices systematically and move towards better ways of living. They are instead preparing for this catastrophic biosphere breakdown that's already well underway by fortifying borders and building walls, by developing new surveillance and warfare technologies, AI, drones, and so on. Excuse me. And then you write that these technologies are being tested, when you wrote this piece, on the people of Palestine, Gaza. Of course, there's ostensibly a ceasefire in place now, and yet that has continued. The violence, the indiscriminate killings have continued. To me, it seems like there are sort of two functions of things like what's happening in Gaza, of these genocides, these outbursts of colonial violence, multiple functions. Now, of course, there's the sort of cold-hearted desire to control a population. They called it, the Israelis used to call it mowing the lawn when they go into Gaza and kill people indiscriminately, keeping the rabble in check, essentially. But to me, there's also, there's the testing of these technologies. Israel, of course, is one of, if not the world's leader, a pioneer in surveillance technologies, different forms of advanced warfare, drone warfare, assassination, and various military technologies from bombs on down. And they sell those technologies to governments around the world. But number three, there's also this element of instilling fear. We were talking about agency and people's ability to envision the future by not only conducting a genocide, but live streaming it around the world, denying the basic facts that people are seeing with their eyes at the same time that people are seeing it. You're destabilizing people's sense of truth. You're destroying their agency. You're destroying their ability to respond to these situations. You're inculcating fear in those who might otherwise challenge these systems of power.
They're crushing our spirit as well. I mean, of course, the spirit of the Palestinian people, but also globally.
Yes, absolutely. So I just wonder if you can respond to that, because it seems to me that this fear campaign is so essential, and I often think that more than anything else in this time, what we need is courage. We need to find our heart in all of this, because it's so easy in the face of a genocide to become numb, to turn away, to close your eyes, to close your heart off, to lose your empathy out of overwhelm, out of fear, out of cowardice, out of different things. And I just wonder what you think about that as we transition towards, how do we respond to this crisis? How do we move forward in a positive way as communities? How do we resist the destruction and effectively push back against these imperial escapades and regain our agency and our ability to act?
Yeah, that is a very difficult question to answer. I mean, what can we do? What are the steps that we need to take in order to right the wrongs that are going on in the world, and also try to halt the destruction of the biosphere? And you're right. I think it would be naive to sort of believe that the politicians, especially the Western ruling class, are not aware, as they claim. I mean, if you just judge by the words they say or write, you might think that they don't understand the situation. But it would be naive to believe that they don't know, because they've got some of the best scientists and advisors, who I think understand the reality of the situation very well, perhaps better than most people in the world do. So I think they are getting good information, realistic information about where this crisis is headed and the kind of world that we're plunging into. But of course, their focus is not to make sure that people are able to survive, or there are equitable opportunities for people to survive in this world, survive and live. I think their focus is obviously to maintain their power and their wealth. And so their work is to sort of sow doubt and confusion and in the public's mind about the reality of what's happening, and to keep the public unaware and miseducated about the scale and the severity of the poly crisis and that we're facing. They have these vast systems, powerful agencies, the media, and I think academia is also partially, at least, part of their toolkit in sort of keeping the public miseducated and unaware. So I think the most important, or the foundational step that we need to somehow try to take is to sort of to get this awareness across to the global public about the reality of our situation and the root causes behind global environmental, ecological, and social political injustices. And I think if we if the global public were able to grasp how all these different problems are interconnected and sort of join the dots with their root causes in the modern techno-industrial capitalist systems, then I think we would have taken the first steps towards figuring out collectively what we should do. And I don't think it's up to me or up to anyone to sort of tell anyone, what the best pathway for the future is, or what the future should be like. But I think it should come from a public deliberation, and the public needs to be aware, it needs to be educated, uh, and it needs to be a comprehensive education that incorporates ecological thinking or ecological understanding, as well as political understanding, as you spoke about earlier. So I think education and awareness among the global public is the first sort of hurdle that we need to sort of pass. But of course, the ruling class use all their might and wealth to sort of prevent that from happening. And so I think we need to try to sort of figure out how to sort of maybe sidestep the systems of education and research that they have put in place, and maybe try to find some alternatives where we can educate one another on a more, like local community scale and global scale as well, because we have these, technologies of communication to try to educate one another. But I think we need these kinds of decentralized, like non-traditional or non-system controlled modes of education that sort of makes people aware of the fundamental problems that or the root causes of ecological and social political injustices around the world. Once people are aware of the root causes, I think it will be pretty obvious to people that the root causes are the barriers as well towards doing anything realistic and meaningful about it. So if people have reached that stage of awareness, then perhaps there might be the possibility to sort of collectively chart a different path towards the future. But that is the major challenge I see right now, is to sort of get that awareness and education across. And it's something that I'm trying to work on right now as well. Yeah, in the end, it's all about sort of regaining our political agency. And without awareness, I don't think we will even realize that we need to sort of desperately try to get our political agency back. But the ruling class has, of course, invested in all these. You mentioned all these technologies of intimidation and violence and destruction, but also there's all these technologies of distraction and diversion and entertainment, and these are all AI generated content, or there's so much distraction, and from TV to sports to everything. So much of modern life is a distraction to sort of not have us thinking about the major problems of the world and who are causing it. So yeah, I think that is the battle that I think is quite fundamental to moving forward. I think it's going to be quite important.
Yeah.
Yes, I would like to ask you, like, what do you think about these new technologies that that are being introduced in the world rapidly? AI and AI is the a major technology that's sort of steering global culture.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that it's a disaster in every possible way. It's a ecologically, socially, politically, AI is leading us further into disaster quicker than ever. It is mainly benefiting the largest corporations on the planet, militaries, and repressive governments in various ways. It's mainly being used as a form of mass surveillance to supercharge capitalism, business, and commerce, which essentially means extraction around the planet. And of course, it's being used by militaries for targeting, for weapons development, and as a form of cyber warfare itself. So, this is emblematic of many of the technologies that we're facing. And we're seeing that with technologies like AI, we're seeing it with drones, we're seeing it with all kinds of things. The military, for example, their use of AI, not just for cyber operations, but also for targeting, for intelligence gathering and analysis. Any use that activists or, people like you and me put these tools to is going to be completely overshadowed by what corporations are doing. Of course, there was a scandal recently where Microsoft Corporation has been advertising their AI as being, Copilot, as being of great use for climate research. And they had some employees who ended up quitting and blowing the whistle on them because it was the technology that they were developing ostensibly for climate was being used by oil companies for enhanced oil recovery. And so, this is something that we see. There's these paradoxes that the technologies that many people believe are most useful for empowering us through conversations like this, exchanging information globally, spreading awareness of these issues, I think they're being used much more powerfully to destroy the planet and to increase the pace and scale of exploitation and destruction than they're being used by our movements, unfortunately. Does that mean never use the technologies? In my opinion, no. They exist, and whether or not I use them or you use them will unfortunately not be enough leverage to shut these platforms down. And so, if we can get some marginal benefits for them, for our movements, for transformative, revolutionary social change, then I think we should pragmatically adopt them with caution in certain circumstances. But we need to understand that these are not sort of utopian projects or pathways to sustainability and justice. They are largely tools that have been developed for expanding the power of empire. And, this is one way that I think about renewable energy technologies, for example, is many people look at renewable energy and they say, this technology is beautiful. It was developed to produce energy without carbon emissions, and it represents a pathway towards a more sustainable future. And in my view, it's more accurate to say that we live in a global industrial civilization which has been constrained by energy availability and is being increasingly constrained as fossil fuel reserves, especially conventional, easy to access fossil fuels, are becoming more and more difficult to access. The energy return on energy investment is getting lower and lower. And so to enable increased growth economically, globally, which essentially means more extraction. When I say growth, I sort of use that as a proxy for the war against the planet. More energy is useful to that process. And so I think it could be just as correct, if not more so, to look at renewable energy technologies as a strategy to increase energy availability to industry and to power growth than as something that has anything to do with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's a response to scarcity and an attempt to bypass it. Just like nuclear power is being pushed quite heavily now because of the high energy demands of AI and data centers. So nuclear power is not being promoted there for any other reason other than increasing energy availability to power these data centers, which are highly profitable, which are very useful to those in power in their geopolitical designs, and also, to militaries and corporations. So this is the crisis that we find ourselves in. I think that these technologies can often be to those of us who, are in the general public. Another example of this that's less sort of on the deliberate manipulation side and more on the unintended consequences side is that the spread of cheap solar panels around the world has led to, in certain regions like parts of Pakistan and the Punjab, it's led to rural farmers being able to install deep wells to pump water out of aquifers in places that was not possible to do so before, possible or cost effective, because there was no grid electric tie-in and they had no access to generators or cheap enough diesel to run generators to pump with fossil fuels. And that's leading to faster aquifer drawdowns in these regions. And so in a situation like that, the increased availability and lower prices of solar panels is not actually reducing carbon emissions because there was no carbon emissions happening in that specific site before. What it's actually doing is simply increasing water extraction. And so these unintended consequences are quite common across the world and across different types of technologies. One example that I talked about in my book is that in the United States, when the automobile, the car, was first introduced, it was hailed widely in newspapers, in public discourse, as a solution to the pollution problem that was being faced by cities at the time, which was excrement from horses. Because there were thousands of horses in the cities. Horses were drawing carriages, they were moving people around, moving freight around, hauling cargo, and these horses would poop everywhere. And it was a major pollution and public health issue in these cities at the time. And so when the car was introduced, people thought this was a solution to that issue. And, here we are now, however many years later, 150 years later, 125 years later, and not only are cars one of the major sources of pollution in this country and around the world, but they're also, how many people are killed in car accidents? I think more people have been killed in car accidents than in all the wars of the 20th century combined. So, and that's not including if you calculate the climate impact and the amount of future deaths that are likely from the climate impact of these cars. So this so-called solution is going to result in, and is already resulting in, not just millions and millions, hundreds of millions likely of deaths in the future, if you include the climate impacts, but all of these other runoff effects in terms of mining impacts and so on. So, I tend to be quite critical of technological solutions for this very reason, because they're usually exploited by those in power for their benefit more than anything else. And because they usually have major unintended consequences that sometimes we can't even think of before they surface. And that's why I tend to gravitate towards the simple and the time-tested ways of living. People have lived sustainably on this planet for thousands and thousands of generations. And that has happened in many different ways, in different places around the world. People have gotten their food in different ways, made their homes in different ways, and had different relationships and political structures for governing their societies and relating to each other and the land around them. But they all share certain characteristics: a relatively small scale, low energy, based on local resources, built on some sort of ethic of reciprocity with the non-human forms of life and the landscape around them, often with ethical, political, and spiritual systems built around that ethic. That's what's time-tested. That's what actually has been proven to be sustainable. So when I look at, for example, climate researchers presenting these models and projections of the future, saying that we get enough solar panels, electric cars, wind turbines, we reduce the scale of consumerism in these different ways, and we can get to sort of a techno-industrial modernity that is sustainable. People often talk about a modest European lifestyle as being the ideal future for everyone on the planet. Not only is that quite literally Eurocentric and culturally blinkered as a vision, but to me, that's something that only has ever existed in models. There has never been a sustainable techno-industrial modernity. It's a theory. It's an idea. It's a fiction. It's a figment of these people's imagination. And they're very smart people who are getting paid, in many cases, a lot of money to produce models and do research on it to, create what are essentially glorified fairy tales, these models and these papers and these projections that say we can do this and it can look like this and it can be really beautiful. I have a lot of doubt about the models that they project and that they show. And that doubt is based on the preponderance of the evidence, which is that has never been done before without incurring vast ecological costs and without requiring huge amounts of colonialism and exploitation around the world in the supply chains.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Max. And I think one of the reasons that, these glorified fairy tale solutions, as you put it so well, I think one of the reasons why they are pushed so much by policymakers, by experts, by researchers, I think is the fact that, in the modern world, we have gotten too used to certain comforts. We are shielded from the forces of nature by our technologies, and we don't have to apply so much. I mean, for most of us, at least the two of us, and most people who will be listening to this podcast, we don't have to work hard physically. Life is very easy for us in terms of the amount of physical exertion or effort we have to put in to sustain our lives. And I think part of the reason that the solutions that are proposed for the climate and ecological crisis tend to be very tech focused is because most people, certainly the people who are proposing those solutions, seemingly cannot imagine an alternate lifestyle, which is going to be harder. I'm pretty sure it's going to require more physical work. It's going to require a broader skill set in terms of, like, for example, growing your own food as much as possible, or making your own clothes, or basic stuff, essentials. So it's going to be and it's going to require more collective living and collective action, more community based sort of existence. And this is kind of like, I think this is a mental barrier that people are unable to sort of even dare to cross or try to it's a huge mental barrier for people. And I think this unwillingness to sort of imagine that life at this level of comfort and luxury is, for at least for 8 billion people, it's impossible to sustain. And yet the people who have been put in charge of making decisions and sort of doing studies and figuring out pathways to address our problems are basically sort of stuck in this way of modern thinking, where they rule out all these alternative possibilities, ways of living and relating with one another that are that our ancestors that's how they lived and that's how they went about their lives. But apparently in modern times, that way of living is sort of, I don't know, there's a stigma attached to it, or some thinking that is sort of primitive or backward, or it's like it goes against all the awesome progress that we've made over the past at least a couple of centuries. So yeah, I think this is a part of the dishonesty of research and education that gets done in this arena of climate and ecological action, that the full range of possibilities, the spectrum of action and work that we could do is limited by this narrow, like select group of privileged people who have decided that, like that having to work hard, do physical labor to make our livelihood is in some way going backward or primitive. Yes. So this is something that I often think about, and I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was sort of the foundation of a recent piece that I wrote about. It was called Decolonizing the Degrowth Movement's Imaginary of Technology. And I was critiquing specifically a piece that Jason Hickel, who, for better or for worse, is sort of perceived as the leader or the most prominent figure of the degrowth movement globally, and who, both emerges from and replicates, in my view, a very Eurocentric approach towards these issues. There's a lot of his work that I admire and respect, and he's quite an intelligent person, so I don't want to sort of cast general aspersions on him, because there's some things I think he gets very right. But there's other areas that I have significant disagreements with him. And he wrote a piece in the Monthly Review that was basically opposing. It was talking about how the degrowth movement embraces technological innovation, technological progress. And this is actually, if you look at the history of the degrowth movement, and where it emerged from, some of the early thinkers like Serge Latouche, who actually proposed a moratorium on all new technological development in recognition that there are these unintended consequences and that the development of new technologies is biased inherently towards increasing the power of those in power, the ruling class, and the institutions that they uphold. That these things are inherently dangerous, that technology is usually not neutral, that usually it is biased in one way or another. It creates unexpected outcomes. And yeah, so I think that I tend to align myself much more closely with the worldview that you're talking about here. I'm reminded of Arundhati Roy, who wrote a piece a number of years ago in which she traveled to a region in central India, I believe, where Naxalite rebels have been fighting against essentially corporate government joint major industrial development projects, logging, mining, and so on, different forms of extraction and so-called development. And she interviewed people there and wrote a very powerful piece about her experience. At the end of her piece, she said, if there's any hope for the world at all, it does not live in climate change conference rooms or in cities with tall buildings. It lives low down on the ground with its arms around the people who go to battle every day to protect their forests, their mountains, and their rivers, because they know that the forests, the mountains, and the rivers protect them. I think that's why, I named my newsletter Biocentric. That's why my work is about trying to shift this, because I think that once we get out of that hubristic imperial mindset, which I think even has infiltrated much of the anti-imperialist left, in the West especially, but even elsewhere, then I think that's where we're actually going to find ways to move forward. And I don't think it's progress in the sense that that Hickel was writing about. There's an old quote. Let's see if I can find it. It's something about, sometimes if you're headed in the wrong direction, progress means turning back, And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in, is that we've been headed in the wrong direction and we need to shift dramatically, and I think there are a lot of different directions that can go in. I think it's very much dependent upon the local ecology, local political circumstances, and many questions like that. I certainly am not going to have control over the course of the future, in any significant way. But, like you, I'm trying to do the same thing, educate people, spread awareness of these issues, try and build grassroots people's movements, both for sort of real forms of climate resilience, unlike what you were often given in your PhD studies, and resisting the encroachment of corporate power and empire around the world. Everywhere it shows up, it's happening, unfortunately, everywhere in different guises, and so I think there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, Max, I agree with you completely. That's the kind of work that I myself try to do. Yeah, hopefully we can keep discussing about these important topics and try to inspire and educate and empower one another moving forward.
Very much so. Aashis, thank you so much. I really appreciate you, admire your work and your thinking very much. So I look forward to seeing what comes next for you. I know you said you've got some things in the works, and I'll be happy to put any links that you'd like in the description for the show, articles that you've written, anything along those lines. So please, let's be in touch about that, and we'll see where we go from here. It's going to be a hell of a ride. The coming years and decades are going to be, as you know, better than most. They're going to be increasingly challenging and chaotic in many ways, dangerous.
Yeah.
And yet I think in that also resides opportunity, because the oppressive systems and structures of power are themselves going to be challenged by this ecological breakdown. And that means that we have opportunities to help topple them and build something better.
Yes, definitely. Change is coming no matter what, and it's going to be a cataclysmic change. So many things that we see as invincible or set in stone are not going to be around in the same way or form as they are today. So there are opportunities despite the overall grim prognosis of the situation. This is these are opportunities that we need to be prepared for, I think, to gain our agency back as people. And thank you very much, Max, for inviting me for this conversation. And I look forward to learning more from you and having some more of these discussions in the future as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, you as well. Thank you very much, Aashis. Thanks for staying up late for this conversation. Early morning for me and late night for you. So yeah, I appreciate it.
It's not a problem at all. Thank you so much for having me, Max.
Take care. We'll talk soon.
We'll stay in touch. Yes. Bye-bye.
I want to thank you for listening to our show and let you know a few ways you can support Truth and Reckoning. First, share this broadcast with your friends and family. Leave a positive review via your podcast app. Visit the Truth and Reckoning YouTube channel and leave a thumbs up and a comment. The full scope of the work of CELDF, including this show, comes with a financial cost. So if you're able to make a donation, go to CELDF.org. That's CELDF.org. But most importantly, our goal for this show is to empower you to take action. So the best way you can show your support is to get involved with your community and protecting the place where you live. Thank you very much.